Imagine an ocean that had turned into a hunting ground, where unseen predators lurked beneath the waves, striking without warning, vanishing into the depths before the screams had faded. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, and in its early years, Germany ruled the seas. At the dawn of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean became the most vital artery of survival for Britain and the Allies. Everything, food, weapons, fuel, soldiers, had to cross that vast expanse. And in those dark waters, the German U-boats waited. These submarines, sleek and silent, formed the core of Admiral Dönitz's strategy. The tonnage war. His goal was chillingly simple: sink Allied merchant ships faster than they could be built, strangle Britain's lifeline, and force her into submission. The early phase of this conflict would later be remembered by German submariners as die glückliche Zeit, or the happy time. Between mid-1940 and early 1941, U-boats roamed freely across the North Atlantic, preying on lightly escorted or completely unprotected convoys. In those months, they sank hundreds of ships, over 471 merchant vessels, crippling Allied logistics and morale. Dönitz's wolfpack tactics were brutally efficient: coordinated night attacks by multiple submarines on a single convoy, each strike timed to overwhelm the escorts and maximize chaos. Churchill would later admit, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." His fear was justified. The U-boats were not just weapons. They were psychological terror, haunting the sailors who crossed the ocean and the strategists who watched Britain's supplies dwindle. Then came 1942, and with America's entry into the war, a second happy time began. German U-boats turned their periscopes toward the U.S. eastern seaboard, exploiting poor coastal defenses and unescorted ships illuminated by city lights. They called it the American shooting season. Entire tankers were torpedoed within sight of coastal towns. In that single year, 160 Allied ships were sent to the bottom. For the Germans, it felt like victory was only a matter of time. For the Allies, the Atlantic had become a graveyard of steel and oil. But beneath this tide of destruction, change was coming, one that would soon turn the hunters into the hunted. By early 1943, the balance in the Atlantic began to shift in ways few could have predicted. Just months earlier, Grand Admiral Dönitz and his commanders were confident that their wolfpacks could bring Britain to its knees. In March alone, German U-boats sank 108 Allied ships, an astonishing total that sent shockwaves through London and Washington. To many, it looked as though the war at sea was turning decisively in Germany's favor. Allied planners feared that the U-boats might choke off Britain's supply routes entirely, cutting off fuel, food, and troops. Yet, within 2 months, the hunters of the deep would become the hunted. The shift was not the result of one single miracle or secret weapon, but a convergence of innovation, coordination, and intelligence. The Allies had finally begun to master the dark science of anti-submarine warfare. For years, the Royal Navy and its partners had been reacting, constantly outpaced by the cunning and stealth of German submarines. But now, the Allies were learning to anticipate. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to make the Battle of the Atlantic their top priority. This decision delayed the planned invasion of Western Europe, but it was essential. Without control of the sea lanes, the Allies could never launch an offensive on the continent. Reinforcements, tanks, and munitions had to move safely across the Atlantic first. By the spring of 1943, new technologies were beginning to close the deadly mid-Atlantic air gap, a vast area beyond the reach of Allied aircraft where U-boats hunted with near impunity. Very long-range bombers, like the B-24 Liberator, began to patrol these waters. Escort carriers, converted from merchant ships, brought air cover directly to the convoys. At sea, Radar and sonar grew more precise, allowing destroyers and corvettes to detect submarines even through darkness and fog. And crucially, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park had once again broken German naval ciphers, giving them the ability to reroute convoys away from danger. It wasn't foolproof. Decrypting signals often took hours, but it was enough to give the Allies a strategic edge. Meanwhile, the Germans were facing mounting problems of their own. Radio traffic between submarines gave away their positions. Air patrols spotted their wakes, and as losses mounted, morale began to crack. The tide that had once favored the U-boats was turning fast, and the very ocean that had once sheltered them was becoming their grave. In January 1943, world leaders gathered in Casablanca to decide the next phase of the war. The air was thick with tension. The Allies had achieved crucial victories in North Africa, yet the Atlantic remained a bleeding wound. The German U-boats continued to exact a heavy toll on merchant convoys, and without control of those sea lanes, no invasion of Europe could ever be mounted. It was here, in Casablanca, that a pivotal decision was made, one that would change the course of the naval war. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that before D-Day, before the liberation of Europe, the Atlantic had to be secured. It was the artery that kept Britain alive and connected to the industrial might of the United States. Every bullet, every tank, every soldier destined for the front lines had to pass through waters infested with U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic is the dominating factor all throughout the war, Churchill warned. And at Casablanca, his warning became strategy. The conference resolved that the defeat of the U-boat threat was to be the Allies' highest priority. The long-planned invasion of France would be postponed until 1944, allowing resources to be diverted toward convoy protection and anti-submarine development. It was a decision met with some frustration from generals eager to strike Germany directly. But the logic was irrefutable. Without victory at sea, every other plan was doomed to failure. In the months that followed, this shift in focus began to take shape. The Allies poured industrial and scientific power into the Atlantic theater. Escort vessels were built in staggering numbers, radar and sonar technology was rapidly improved, and the deployment of escort carriers became more widespread. The Royal Canadian Navy expanded its patrol zones, linking with British and American commands to form a unified Atlantic defense network. But coordination wasn't the only challenge. Intelligence sharing between the Allies was still limited and bureaucratic. Casablanca changed that too. A new combined Allied command for the Atlantic was created to centralize decision-making and standardize tactics across fleets. From this moment, the Atlantic was no longer a patchwork of national efforts. It was a single, coordinated front. For the first time in the war, the Allies were no longer reacting. They were planning ahead. Casablanca marked the turning point when the U-boat menace stopped dictating the battle's tempo. From here onward, the Allies would fight the Atlantic War on their own terms. Across the frozen Atlantic, one stretch of ocean became infamous among sailors and submariners alike: the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap. It was a vast, desolate region where Allied ships had no protection from the skies. Beyond the range of land-based aircraft from Britain, Iceland, or North America, this 1,000-kilometer expanse became the deadliest hunting ground for German U-boats. Allied crews called it Torpedo Junction, and for good reason. Once a convoy entered this zone, they were effectively blind. No air patrols, no radar cover, only the endless sea and the fear of what lurked beneath it. For the U-boats, this gap was a paradise. Hidden by storms and waves, they waited for convoys to enter, then struck without warning. Torpedoes slashed through the dark water, detonating with thunderous force. Ships vanished in seconds, leaving behind nothing but burning oil and shattered lifeboats. Radio silence was often the only protection, but it rarely worked. The Germans had learned to read the sea and the patterns of the convoys. The gap represented one of the Allies' most pressing vulnerabilities. Churchill knew that unless they could close it, no ship was safe. The British Coastal Command pushed for long-range patrol aircraft, planes capable of flying deep into the Atlantic and back. But resources were stretched thin. The Royal Air Force prioritized bombing campaigns over Germany, while American forces focused on the Pacific. The result was devastating. In early 1943, U-boats dominated the air gap, and losses skyrocketed. But this would soon change. At the Casablanca Conference, Allied leaders finally recognized the need for air coverage over the entire Atlantic. The solution was twofold: expand the use of very long-range VLR bombers and deploy escort carriers. The VLR B-24 Liberator became the game changer, capable of patrolling farther and longer than any previous aircraft. By spring, the number of operational Liberators had tripled, bringing the once invisible U-boats under constant threat. Meanwhile, smaller aircraft carriers, converted merchant vessels, were introduced to accompany convoys directly. Their aircraft could launch reconnaissance missions, spot periscopes, and even dive-bomb submarines. For the first time, the hunters were being watched from above. Closing the air gap didn't just change tactics. It transformed morale. Sailors who once faced the Atlantic's deadly silence now looked to the skies and saw friendly aircraft circling overhead. The balance of fear was shifting. What had once been a graveyard of ships was becoming a battlefield where the Allies could finally strike back. By early 1943, science and technology began to rewrite the fate of the Atlantic. The Allies, long haunted by the unseen terror of the U-boats, were now arming themselves with tools that could pierce the darkness below. Machines and mathematics began to outthink instinct and luck, giving the convoys a new shield. And the hunters nowhere to hide. Among these breakthroughs was ASDIC, the early form of sonar. With it, Allied escorts could now hear the ocean, detecting the faint echoes of submerged submarines. A trained operator could listen to the rhythmic pings and tell not only that something was there, but how far it was and in what direction it moved. Once a contact was confirmed, destroyers would close in, releasing depth charges set to explode at precise depths. The sea would erupt in violent geysers, the concussion tearing into steel hulls hidden below. Sailors described the sight as both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Columns of water shooting skyward, followed by the eerie stillness of the deep. Yet sonar had its limits. It worked best when submarines were already submerged. It couldn't always find those running silently on the surface at night. That's where radar came in. The new 10-centimeter radar, mounted on ships and aircraft, was capable of detecting the tiny silhouette of a U-boat even through fog or darkness. For the first time, the Germans lost the advantage of invisibility. What had once been their sanctuary, surfacing under cover of night to recharge batteries, became their vulnerability. Another leap forward came from high-frequency direction finding, or Huff Duff. This system could trace the location of U-boats by intercepting their radio transmissions, often from as far as 25 kilometers away. Each time a U-boat reported its position to headquarters, the signal betrayed its hiding place. Allied escorts began triangulating those signals, coordinating attacks before the submarines even reached their targets. And then there were the weapons. The Hedgehog, a forward-firing spigot mortar, allowed ships to launch a pattern of explosives ahead of their path, increasing the chances of a direct hit. Combined with traditional depth charges, it made life beneath the waves a constant nightmare. Technology had finally caught up with German cunning. Piece by piece, the Allies were turning the Atlantic into a web of sensors, signals, and firepower. For the first time, the ocean itself seemed to be on their side. In May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its breaking point. The clash between convoy SC-130 and the German wolfpacks would mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's once feared U-boat fleet. The convoy sailing from Halifax, Nova Scotia, toward Liverpool consisted of 37 merchant ships escorted by 8 warships. Each man aboard knew the dangers ahead. The Atlantic was a graveyard, and German intelligence had already marked their route. Waiting in the darkness were more than 25 U-boats, organized into 3 deadly wolfpacks, Donau 1, Donau 2, and Iller. As the convoy approached the mid-Atlantic gap, conditions turned rough. Visibility dropped, and the sea churned with icy waves. Perfect hunting weather for submarines. On May 18th, the attacks began. Torpedoes streaked through the black water, their trails illuminated by flashes of fire and thunderous explosions. Yet this time, the convoy was ready. New radar systems, HFK-DF tracking, and coordinated escort maneuvers turned the tide. Destroyers swept the seas ahead of the formation, pinpointing contacts and forcing submarines to dive. For days, the battle raged across hundreds of miles of ocean. Allied aircraft joined the fight as the convoy neared the range of long-range patrol bombers. The U-boats, once unseen predators, now found themselves hunted from above. Bombs and depth charges shattered the sea, rupturing steel hulls and scattering crews into the cold Atlantic. By May 21st, the wolfpacks were in disarray. 3 U-boats were destroyed, another crippled, and dozens more forced to retreat. Not a single Allied ship was lost. Among the fallen submarines was U-954, carrying Admiral Dönitz's youngest son, Paul. His death struck the Admiral deeply. It was both a personal and symbolic loss. Within days, Dönitz ordered his remaining U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. For the first time since 1939, the hunters had become the hunted. The month would forever be remembered by the Germans as Black May. From that point onward, the U-boat war would never recover. Allied technology, coordination, and relentless air patrols made the ocean impassable for Germany's once proud submarine fleet. If you found this story of courage and strategy compelling, let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep these untold stories of history alive for future generations.